Today, I'm hoping to tell you a little bit more about our beloved dwarf woodland here in the Southwest, Pinyon-juniper, its birds, and some of the threats facing this habitat specifically from climate change. And so we're going to cover a bit of ground, if it will let me advance. Here we go. So I'm just going to give you, this is a little roadmap of where we're headed. So first, I just want to make sure that everybody is on the same page about what PJ is, what are the main threats, in my estimation, to that habitat and its birds today, and what are some of the unique birds that really call this habitat home. And then I want to dive into some research that we've done in the past 2-3 years here at IBP, looking at Pinyon-juniper bird populations specifically. One, how are they responding directly to climate change in terms of drought and changes to the monsoon rains here in the Southwest? And two, what are the habitat associations of these birds, and what can we infer about their conservation from those habitat associations? And lastly, I'm going to briefly outline a couple of future IBP research projects in Pinyon-juniper, just to kind of give you an idea of where we're going and what I think is interesting as far as unanswered questions, looking towards the future. So first, why should we care about Pinyon-juniper woodlands? Well, they're a very interesting habitat for a variety of reasons, I think. For starters, this is a kind of a dwarf middle elevation woodland, and it is composed of some combination of pinyon pines. There's 2 different pinyon pine species and a variety of juniper species. It's host to a high endemism of wildlife, not just birds, but we will look at birds specifically today. It also covers a huge amount of area. So depending on your favorite estimate, up to 40 million hectares in the Western US, over 10 states, and in this kind of area of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Nevada, it's been estimated that that covers 15% of the total area of those states. So it actually covers a lot of ground, literally and figuratively. It's very variable across its range. And so here you're looking at the different colors are showing different species of juniper, which, as you can see, change as you move from northwest to southeast. You're getting into more monsoonal systems, and there's a lot of differences. So this is a very variable habitat. And perhaps most intriguingly from a research perspective, it's a very understudied habitat. I think Pinyon-juniper has historically had a reputation as being quote unquote bad, or at least unproductive, right? You can't really log it. It's not good for grazing. So what good is it for? And to boot, it is intruding into sagebrush steppe and other habitats and generally making a nuisance of itself. And maybe because of this reputation of it being bad, or maybe for other reasons, I think it's been understudied when it comes to wildlife, which is something that we're trying to rectify a little bit here at IBP. So when you picture Pinyon-juniper woodland, you might picture a variety of different habitats. And that is probably one of the most unique things, as I mentioned, about this habitat, how variable it is. So all 4 of these images represent Pinyon-juniper, quote unquote, on the Colorado Plateau, but with very different appearances in terms of the structure and the understory and how much canopy cover there is. And it can kind of beg this question, well, what is Pinyon-juniper woodland? Is it just such a vague term that it covers a lot of ground? And that's a fraught question, which I'm not going to answer today. But there is one classification of breaking it down into 3 major types, right? And in a really seminal paper that came out in 2009. And so one of those, I'll go over the 3 quickly. One is Pinyon-juniper savanna, which is very open, tends to have a grassy understory, and tends to occur at lower elevations that are more arid. Another, which is probably most common in the Great Basin, is wooded shrublands, where you're actually getting conifers occurring alongside a heavily shrub-dominated understory. And then what we're going to focus on today, primarily, and this is the best studied kind of category of Pinyon-juniper, is persistent woodlands. So here it's dominated by conifers. There's a fairly continuous canopy cover of 20 to 40%. And the understory is more variable. It might have grasses and shrubs, but they're not dominant, as you saw in those other photos. And this is what we tend to think of in some of the best known national parks as terms of old growth woodland, where you get these old growth forms of the trees. And this is a very stable habitat. All right, birds, because I can't, I need to talk about birds as soon as possible. So here in the Southwest, we actually have 4 species that are endemic to pinyon juniper, at least in the United States. Woodhouse's scrub jay does some other fun stuff down in Mexico. And that's juniper titmouse, gray vireo, pinyon jay, and the scrub jay. So these are birds that really only occur in this habitat, which makes them really unique. There are very few birds that are that specialized and that endemic in their habitats in North America. We also have a lot of what I would call regional endemics. So in the Southwest, these birds pretty much only occupy pinyon juniper woodlands, though they do occur in other habitats in other parts of the United States and throughout their breeding range. But pinyon juniper bird communities are much bigger than just these specialists, right? We have a bunch of birds, both of understory shrub and also the canopy, the conifers that occur in this habitat. And so there's quite a lot of diversity of birds, many of them, it must be said, very gray in pinyon juniper. So it's quite a complex community, even if it's not as diverse as a tropical rainforest, for example. And one pinyon juniper bird that's received a lot of attention and may be receiving even more attention in the future is the Pinyon Jay. And the Pinyon Jay is truly an exceptional bird for a variety of reasons. It's probably one of the most fascinating birds in North America, in my very biased opinion. But so this is a bird that's really strongly co-evolved with the pinyon pine. The pinyon pine nuts form a huge part of their diet, and they've essentially, their whole lifestyle is based around this tree. So one of the things they love to do is to cache nuts. The pinyon pine produces nuts, and these birds hide those nuts in the ground, and they use that as a source of food throughout the year. So just one pinyon jay could cache up to 2,600 pinyon pine nuts in one autumn, which is a very large amount. So in order to remember where all those nuts are hidden, you have to have a really amazing spatial memory. And so that's one of the fascinating aspects of this bird. They're also super tied to when pinyon pines go into breeding mode, these birds start breeding. So just the appearance of green pinyon cones initiate breeding behavior in this bird, which is quite crazy. Their social lives are complicated and fascinating as well. It lives in very large flocks. There used to be flocks of 250, 300 birds. In recent years, those are much smaller, but they're essentially a colonial breeder. So one group of birds has a large group territory, which is massive, 3,000 plus hectares. They are a cooperative breeder, which means that young birds from previous nests will help their parents raise successive young, which is an unusual behavior in birds. And they're also one of the earliest breeding songbirds in North America. So they can start breeding in February in years where they were able to cache lots of pine nuts because they can actually feed those to their young, and they don't have to wait for insects to come or spring to show up. So that's very unique as well. And unfortunately, another reason why this bird is very unique is that its populations are declining very, very rapidly, right? So we know that there's almost a 4% population decline per year and an 80% population decline since we've had breeding bird survey data. And that obviously is very alarming. I think it's probably safe to say, and others have said, that this is the fastest declining bird in Western North America. So there are lots of reasons why that might be, and I'm going to cover some of them now in terms of threats. But these threats are also more general to other birds that share pinyon juniper habitat with the jay. So the biggest one, I think, in my opinion, is habitat loss. And this includes both clearance and wildfire. So when we're thinking about these persistent woodlands, there's a lot of research that shows that these are not fire-adapted habitats. So fire comes back, in some cases, on a 300 to 400 year interval. And when they burn, they burn. So the habitat is lost. So you're looking at a photo of Mesa Verde, where essentially this is an area that burned decades ago, and there's been very little regeneration. And that's one of the issues with these increasing prevalence of mega fires or high severity fires in the West, is that when these habitats burn, they don't seem to be coming back on a time scale where I will be able to enjoy pinyon juniper. They may be back in hundreds of years. And it leaves an opening for invasive species, especially invasive grasses, to take over in areas that have burned. But overall, you're losing habitat when these things burn because they don't regenerate quickly. Um, there's also a long tradition of clearing of pinyon juniper, whether that's chaining, which is attaching a battleship chain to two bulldozers and basically clearing all the conifers on land with it, um, and thinning, right? And so there historically the habitat was cleared for a variety of reasons. One of them being to create rangelands for cattle. But in recent years, while clearance still goes on, there's a more complicated picture. I think it's not just people removing the habitat to remove habitat. You know, it's been discussed that thinning or removal reduces fuel loads and helps prevent megafires. It's thought that it may help with drought survival of the trees, but the evidence for that is limited. And then there's also been a lot of discussion about, can we create habitat for mule deer, for other wildlife, right, in removing. But it's a very fraught political topic. Nevertheless, there is removal going on. And I should add, removal also happens to protect endangered species like, you know, the sage grouse. So removal happens for a variety of reasons, but it does result in habitat loss for pinyon juniper specialist birds. And when we do removals, we do know that the effects of these removals persist through time, right? Regeneration is slow, and even decades later, 50, 60, 70, 80 years later, we still are seeing reduced canopy and also greater understory vegetation after removals. So these have a very long-term impact on the environment. That much is certain. And that kind of begs this question, like, well, are pinyon juniper birds vulnerable to landscape scale factors? And surprisingly, this has not been a very well addressed question. But a recent study has actually looked at, well, what if we measure a bunch of things, landscape composition, disturbance from road and energy infrastructure, and topography at a landscape scale and relate that to the abundance of pinyon juniper birds. And they found that in the case, for example, of this black-throated gray warbler, that the amount of pinyon juniper within a 600-meter buffer of the survey location is a very strong predictor of the abundance of this bird. So that's a sign that these species are responding to landscape level factors, but we just don't have a very good understanding of how that works yet. There's also been some studies looking at thinning that have suggested that landscape scale occupancy is reduced after thinning, but local scale occupancy is not. So they're responding at a landscape scale in a way that they're not responding at a local scale. And then lastly, and I think this is a powerful line of evidence, we've seen that after kind of mass die-offs, and I'll get to that in a second, we just start losing, and this is cases where all the pinyon pines in an area die. We start losing birds species richness and abundance. This is a case from the CO Plateau near Bandelier National Monument and Los Alamos National Lab that's showcasing a major die-off occurred in 2002, 2003, and then they were doing monitoring in the intervening years and looking at what was happening. So this is a big question mark. You know, how much is habitat loss affecting these birds because of their sensitivity to fragmentation? And as I mentioned, this extreme drought. So we know that climate change is affecting habitats both directly and indirectly, and this would be an example of an indirect effect, where trees are drought stressed. Often that means that bark beetles move in and they can take out every single pinyon in an area. So you're getting, in some cases, it's not as extreme as these photos, right? It can be much more limited, but it does vary a lot. And as you can see in this figure, the areas in red are areas, bright red, have experienced 100% pinyon pine mortality. So while it doesn't occur everywhere, where it does occur, it can become a very large problem. And when this happens, it's not just the loss of the pinyon pines, we're also losing canopy cover. We're essentially resetting the successional clock because we're transitioning back towards an earlier successional woodland that's dominated by junipers because we've lost all of our pinyons, and pinyon pines are much more sensitive than junipers to drought. And we've also changed the structure because now we have less canopy cover. we have more understory shrubs. And so there's this question here, right? Well, this is massive changes. Is this going to affect habitat suitability for any kind of pinyon juniper related bird? And I think this ties into a bigger story here about two paradigms that we have about pinyon juniper. And one is an earlier paradigm that the conservation community was very concerned with, and that's expansion and infilling. And this is like pinyon juniper as a bad guy, right? It's expanding into sagebrush habitat, and it's creating all kinds of problems for sage grouse conservation. And it's not just expanding, but it's also infilling, meaning that woodlands that had lower canopy cover are actually becoming woodlands with higher canopy cover. There's young pinyons and junipers coming up in existing woodlands. And so this has been blamed on all kinds of things, right? A legacy of grazing and fire suppression during sort of the early colonial expansion in the United States, on climate change and changes to the distribution of these species. Overall, though, it's like pinyon juniper is bad, and we need to remove it in places where it doesn't belong. It's been misbehaving, and it's going into places where it doesn't belong. The second paradigm is this one of dieback and die-off, right? And so there have been a lot of recent papers that have looked at modeling responses of pinyon and juniper to climate change, especially here in the Four Corners area, where I think we're all more concerned about that. And here we're actually worried about not only losing the habitat due to drought and wildfire, but also like future conditions in which these species won't be able to persist. And this paper is showing predicted changes to the habitat suitability of both pinyon and juniper by the end of the century, with a kind of middle of the road climate change scenario. And so all the bright red areas are predicted to lose all of their pinyons and much of their junipers by the end of the century, if under not the most extreme climate scenario either. And so how do we kind of reconcile these two visions of one is like this habitat is taking over and the other is this habitat is shrinking and we need to save it? Well, there have been some interesting studies that have actually looked at this quantitatively over fairly large areas. One in the Great Basin that showed that, yes, it is expanding from 2000 to 2016. So you're getting a less than 0.5% increase every year. But much of that expansion is infill. So 80% of it was woodlands infilling where there were already woodlands. So that's one view from the north. Another one looked at an even larger time span from basically early colonial colonization from the 1890s to 2017. What has happened? And you can actually see that over a longer time span, things have shifted fairly dramatically. Things that were open are now closed, and things that were closed are now open. And actually, most of the habitats have shifted in that time span. So this was actually an argument that, in fact, it's not necessarily all grazing and fire suppression, that, in fact, expansion was happening in places that likely did not experience grazing or fire suppression historically. But it's one study from one region of Colorado. And we definitely need more studies. We need a better understanding of how this happens. But I think it's clear that this habitat type has expanded and retracted over the years in relation to, and I mean over long time periods, in relation to climate, and that it's possible that climate change is also driving some of this expansion, and also die-offs in different places. There's not really a one good story that fits the entirety of the range of pinyon juniper in the Western United States. And lastly, I want to talk about something that is a major ecological event in pinyon juniper, and that's pinyon pine masting. So we know that these trees produce massive mast years, and pinyon pine specifically is very spatially correlated in terms of where masting occurs. So masting is production of a very large pinyon pine nut crop. It's synchronized across vast areas. One paper estimated that across like 500-kilometer ranges, all the trees would be masting in the same year. And so there's probably climate drivers for this. And they produce these nuts that are just begging to be eaten. They're high in protein and fat content, and the cones mature over time to ensure that wildlife have access to them over months, right? It's not just 1 week and then it's over. So this is a huge event, which presumably is affecting the ecology of lots of different things, not just birds. Um, but we know that it responds to climate. And so there's been some really interesting work that's come out recently that's shown that, for example, in years where cones are being produced, and cone production starts 3 years before you actually get pinyon nuts. In years where there's a high monsoon rainfall, that results in a very high cone production 3 years later. It's very correlated. There's also correlations with the pollination phase, but I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time. Another, in the actual year of cone production, higher late summer temperatures lead to lower cone crops. And all of this is suggesting strongly that climate change is having a major effect on pinyon pine masting, which is very important for Pinyon Jay because Pinyon Jay is highly dependent on these seed crops, but it's likely very important for a variety of other birds and wildlife. We just haven't studied it, and it's not well understood how that happens, but we probably have enough knowledge to make predictions about how pinyon pine cone crops will be changing, and even predict what's going to happen next year or two years in advance. But I think this is kind of an understudied and underappreciated factor in Pinyon Jay's decline, but potentially decline of other Pinyon-juniper bird species. All right. I want to look at some changes to populations of these species in national parks on the southern Colorado Plateau, and relating that to some climate factors. And so I've talked a lot about the indirect effects of climate in this first section, but we know that climate has direct effects too, right? And we also know that bird populations are declining overall in North America. One of the reasons for that is climate change. So recent reviews have said up to 2/3 of North American birds are at risk. And there's these extreme climate events are often much more negative than events that are occurring over longer time periods. So while temperature is increasing overall, average temperature is increasing gradually. In some years, we have extreme spring heat, these drought events, which are really negative. Hundreds of species are potentially affected, according to one recent review. And I like to think of this in terms of hot drought, right? Where it's not just drought, so we're not getting rain, but we're also getting very extreme temperatures, and that puts a lot of pressure on the trees, but it also puts a lot of pressure on birds because you have a risk of dehydration. You also have to find enough food to feed your babies, and when that doesn't happen, you tend not to have very many babies left. So there's also these indirect effects I was talking about earlier. Another factor, climate factor, which I think is really important in the Southwest, are the monsoon rains, right? So we have a North American monsoon, which is a big pulse of precipitation that occurs from July to September. It can go later in some years. And it's quite variable. Some years you get a lot of it. Some years you don't get a lot of it. It's probably tied at least partially to the El Nino, La Nina Southern Oscillation. But in some areas, this represents 50 to 60% of the yearly rainfall, and that's not nothing. We don't really know how the monsoon is going to change in future climate scenarios, but it has been predicted that the timing will be more variable and that the monsoons may arrive later. So we may get more rainfall in August, September instead of in June, July. This is very important for birds because many of our birds migrant birds are what we call molt migrants. And so essentially they do a stopover molt migration. They breed in North America somewhere, like this black-headed grosbeak breeding in Yosemite. They then migrate to a molting grounds, and this is typically in northwestern Mexico, these kind of dry forests that receive 60, 70, 80% of their seasonal rain during the monsoon. And they molt there. They spend a few months there, and then they keep going to another non-breeding location. They spend the rest of the non-breeding season there. And they actually time their arrival on the molting grounds with this peak green up, right? The peak pulse of resources after the monsoons have arrived. There's it's basically like spring in a temperate region. You get a lot of vegetation, a lot of bugs, and it's really great to molt your flight feathers. And so we really wanted to know two questions. Are population trends in our national parks, are they stable? Or are they increasing or decreasing? And are drought and the timing of these monsoon rains affecting bird populations in the monitored parks? So this study actually looked at 6 different parks. This was part of work data that was collected before my time, but which I am glad people did from 2007 to 2018 as part of the Southern Colorado Plateau Inventory and Monitoring Network. And they monitored in 6 parks, but they also did habitat-specific monitoring. And so I'm not going to focus on the other habitats in this talk, but they were looking at grassland shrubland habitats, Pinyon-juniper, of course, and then mixed conifer habitat as well. And you can see with the arrows, the different parks that those were monitored in. So what we have is we have habitat-specific monitoring data, and in which they selected specific habitats, and they went and collected data every 3 years in those parks using point count surveys. And I'm going to skip over a lot of the modeling, and I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about what we decided to include as predictors and why. So we assumed that climate is going to affect birds the next year. If there's drought, they won't have as many babies, and their population goes down the next year. And we also compared climate to a 30-year normal period. So how is the climate in any given year different from this average between 1970 and 2000? And then there's 2 different predictor variables. So we're looking at hot drought, and really a good measure of that is climatic moisture deficit, which is essentially how much water are plants and animals losing to evaporation that's not being replaced by precipitation. And so if you have a high value of this, it means it's very hot drought. And there's a variety of mechanisms why we think this might affect birds and their populations. And the other one was this index of monsoon timing, right? So like I said, it's possible that the monsoon rains will be shifted later into August and September. And so what we did for each year was we divided the amount of rain in June and July by the amount of rain in August and September. And if you get a positive value, then that actually means you have earlier monsoon rains than normal. And if you have a negative value from that, it means the rains came later. So this isn't correlated with the total amount of rainfall, or it may be, but we thought that the timing actually is more important because that is actually going to influence how much green up occurs on the molting grounds for some of these species, and therefore how many resources will be available for them to both molt their feathers and potentially when they're young babies and they don't really know how to find food easily. If you have a really early monsoon, you have more resources regardless of whether you're in Mexico or in the Southwest. And yes, I realize this diagram makes me look like a crazy person, but so let's jump into some results. We remember here, before we actually look at the results, I want to remind people of some things. One is that these are habitat specific, not park-wide trends. So these are the trends of the species in Pinyon-juniper in the parks. And this year effect is also after controlling for climate. So basically, after we remove the effects of drought and monsoon rain, what's happening with populations over time? I'm also going to talk a little bit about this kind of figure because there's quite a few of them in this talk. So this is a forest plot, and you'll see the birds listed in taxonomic order here. So the dotted line in the middle is 0, and you're going to see the estimate from the model, the effect size, and this 95% Bayesian credible interval. And essentially what you need to know about this is just if it overlaps the dotted line, then the effect is not significant. So essentially we're looking at, I also will plot this light green line as the mean of all the Pinyon-juniper specialist species. And the black line when it's present is the mean of all these generalist species. And those are birds that occurred in other habitats as well. So we just modeled this for the species in every habitat, not just in Pinyon-juniper. Okay, but essentially, I won't bury the lead any further. We actually have, I guess, optimistic, positive things overall from 2007 to 2018. Most of the populations were increasing. So in fact, we had 7 species with increasing year trends as supported year trends, and we had 3 species with supported decreasing year trends. And when we dig into park-specific data, which I'm not showing here, we find the same trend that actually at Grand Canyon and Mesa Verde, which were the 2 parks that were included in this analysis, we actually had a lot more increasing populations than decreasing populations. So that's an encouraging thing, perhaps a bit unexpected. What were the species that were declining? Well, primarily it was mountain chickadee, which is not a Pinyon-juniper specialist, and ash-throated flycatcher, which is. So that's intriguing because those two birds don't necessarily share a lot in common. And another interesting thing is that we actually see colonization of these sites by gray vireo. And gray vireo is a bird that actually quite likes open shrubby habitat and not so much persistent woodland habitat, at least down here in the Southwest. So we're actually seeing changes to the species composition, but overall, most things are increasing. And could this be due to Pinyon-juniper woodland dieback? I would say yes, but hold that thought because we're going to come back there in part 3. Overall, though, to put this in context, Pinyon-juniper populations are doing much better than populations of birds in some other habitats. Specifically, higher elevation mixed conifer populations are getting hammered. So it's not to say that there were increases across the board, but that Pinyon-juniper populations are doing well, at least in these highly protected areas. And we also were really interested in, and this is another complicated one, but I will walk you through it, I promise, how local trends in the parks were comparing to regional trends across the Colorado Plateau more generally. And so what you have on the x-axis here is the breeding bird survey trend over the same time interval. So if it's positive in the breeding bird survey, it'll be greater than this dotted line. And if it's on the y-axis, you have our park-wide trends. So essentially, the top left corner it's increasing in the parks, but it's decreasing on the Colorado Plateau. And then you have in this bottom right, the opposite, which is it's increasing on the Colorado Plateau, but not in our parks. And essentially, there are some commonalities to what species are doing what. The spruce fir forest, the highest elevation forest-associated birds are not doing well in our parks, but they were doing better regionally. But conversely, and more related to Pinyon-juniper, a lot of these birds that like open woodlands, specifically Pinyon-juniper woodlands, are doing quite well in our parks, but they're not doing very well regionally. So they're declining regionally, but they're actually increasing in the parks. So this really suggests that there's something going on in regionally, which is resulting in habitat loss potentially, or at the very least, there's something. The birds in national parks are being more protected against population declines than ones in the region more generally, which I think is interesting. All right, looking at drought, we actually find very few effects. So overall, drought is good. How can drought be good? Well, a lot of birds, and I'll touch on this in a second, that occur at high elevations quite like drought because it means less snowpack and you can breed earlier. But if you're a Pinyon-juniper specialist, drought had very little effect. So there are some positive effects and negative effects, but they were all generalist species. All the light green species here, which are the ones that only occur in Pinyon-juniper, did not have a supported effect of drought. Very interesting. We did find that juniper titmouse had a near supported effect, and white-breasted nuthatch did, and those are both year-round residents. They may also benefit from massing. We don't know. But there's a picture of relative resilience to direct effects of drought, which I think is encouraging. Here's the plot that shows the effect of drought on the y-axis and the mean elevation that the bird breeds at. So if you're higher elevations, it means you breed on average at higher elevations at our monitored sites. And you can see our green Pinyon-juniper are here in the middle, right? Middle elevation woodland. And the birds that on average breed at higher elevations had positive effects of drought. But actually, as you go down in elevation, those effects become more negative. In middle elevation, there's no effect. So it just goes to show that actually good news, right? Drought doesn't seem to be negatively affecting Pinyon-juniper specialist birds, at least over this time interval and for these species. Pinyon Jay was not one of the modeled species, in case you're wondering. And then the monsoon rains, right? So we have this average effect that's near zero, but when we actually break it down, there's a lot of positive and negative effects of earlier and later monsoon rains. There's not one general trend for the whole community. And so, it's hard to kind of pick apart general trends here because you have this resident bird, and juniper titmouse and ashlar flycatcher don't like early rains, but a lot of short and long distance migrants do like early rains. And so we've wanted to look at this question in more detail. And so we actually did a little add-on analysis, and we looked at the effect of monsoon timing as a function of whether or not the bird is a molt migrant. And so this is a fancy way of saying that if the bird breeds someplace, does it also molt there? And so for birds that do molt where they breed on the right-hand side of this figure, you can see that the monsoon timing effect tends to be more negative, like for our friend juniper titmouse, or there's no effect. But for birds that molt outside of the breeding grounds, these molt migrants, we actually see that the effects are generally positive, and that this was statistically supported. But the ones that don't molt in the monsoon region, and I'm not going to go into the whys and hows of that, they are not part of this trend. So if you molt on the non-breeding grounds, or essentially not if you're not a molt migrant, there was no effect. So once we have to remove these non-molt migrants that breed outside of their breeding grounds to actually have a statistical effect. So what does that mean? Well, it means that earlier monsoon rains probably are having an effect on populations. We know they lead to more food in northwestern Mexico on the molting grounds. We also know that these stopover molt migrants have the fastest molt of any North American passerine, and they time their arrival for peak green up. And their young arrive even later than their parents, and they molt even faster. And so that actually leads to this scenario where if you arrive there expecting to find a pulse of green vegetation, and the monsoon rains are late, and you arrive to find very little, and you're also your whole evolutionary history has led you to molt as fast as possible, you're going to run into some problems because there's not enough food to molt effectively, potentially. And that's called a phenological mismatch, where they're arriving, they're expecting the monsoons, and the monsoons aren't there because the monsoons are late this year. So what are some take-home points from all this? Well, we actually have some good news. Pinyon-juniper bird populations are increasing in parks, with some exceptions. And the regional declines picked up by the BBS during this period are not occurring within parks. So actually, there are things that we can do when we conserve land to protect populations of these birds. I think that's very good news. We know that climate effects varied by elevation and habitat, but looking specifically at the pinyon-juniper elevations, these are birds that are generally resilient to drought. And that's an interesting finding, unlike birds of higher elevations. And then lastly, I think this is something that's been very understudied that we still don't understand well, but molt migrants are probably vulnerable to later monsoons, or at least to more variable monsoons. But we rarely talk about molting grounds and molt migrants in conservation plans for these species. And a bird that's as abundant as black-throated gray warbler may be a molt migrant, and it may actually be, their population may be dependent on the timing of monsoon rains, which again is an aspect of climate change that we don't really understand very well. So that's just something for future reference. All right, and now moving on to these bird habitat associations, and how does that affect conservation of these birds? So here we were just interested in what are local microhabitat associations for our birds. Is it floristic or structural variables? In other words, is it the structure of the habitat or the species composition of the plants that are most important for determining where you get a high density of these birds? And then to try and better understand winners and losers from drought and mechanical thinning on the basis of those associations. And so this was done in a subset of the parks that you saw earlier, in 3 parks: Bandelier, Mesa Verde, and Grand Canyon. And again, it's using a point count data set from 2007 to 2018. What's intriguing is there's only 1 year data from Bandelier here, but they actually did a thinning project right before the bird surveys were conducted. Well, before, during, and after, but So we actually have an area that's been thinned, and then the reminder that Bandelier also suffered this massive die-off of its pinyon pines, and that actually occurred about 5 years before the bird surveys were conducted there. So 1 year is not, it's a small window, it's a snapshot of what's happening at Bandelier, but it is important to keep in mind when we look at the results. And I am not going to list all these, but what is amazing is that I was left with this really cool data set of lots and lots and lots of different covariates of habitat. And they were collected at every point count station in every year that birds were surveyed. So we actually have a measurement of how habitat, microhabitat is changing over time. And it also encompassed a pretty wide variety of the different strata, from the ground to the canopy. We can make predictions about how these things will change with drought. Like, we know that canopy closure should decrease. We know that canopy height should decrease with this dieback and die-off. And as a result, we know that shrub height and shrub foliar cover should increase because they're getting more access to sunlight, less competition with conifers. So we can make predictions about how birds would benefit or not from changes with drought and thinning. And these Pinyon-juniper woodlands have a shrubby understory. It's quite variable, like I mentioned, and it's also quite variable in its species composition. And so we were really interested in, are these birds actually keying in on specific shrubs? Like, do they like sagebrush more than they like cliff rose? And is that a big factor in what attracts them to a certain spot? So again, I will skip over all the nitty gritty here, but we're looking at breeding densities of birds. That's our currency. And we accounting for imperfect detection, and we basically are modeling 25 different birds with a bunch of covariates, and essentially are able to get something that looks a lot like this, right? So this is the density, the estimated density of each bird in each of our parks and overall across all years on average. So it's a bit of an overwhelming figure to look at. But I want to draw your attention to some of these species, right? So if you look at gray vireo, if you look at plumbeous vireo, if you look at mountain chickadee, what you find is that the densities are much lower at Bandelier, which experienced this big die-off, which experienced thinning following the big die-off, than they are at other parks, especially something like black-throated gray warbler. Normally, you can't throw a rock without hitting 2 or 3 of them, and they're basically absent. And so, that suggests that there's some role of this major die-off, right, in terms of what's happening. And sure enough, if you actually look at the effects of the park, right, that Bandelier has a lot of negative effects, and compared to the other 2 parks that we were looking at, which is not, this is a fancy statistical model to tell you what you could know from just looking at the numbers of detections, like that they're not being detected, they're not present there. And there's something going on that's very bad, which is probably the loss of every pinyon pine in the whole landscape. So I just want to highlight that's kind of a major finding that we didn't necessarily need the fancy models for. But so because pinyon pines are lost, do these birds actually care about whether there's more pinyon or juniper in the woodland? Is that a major factor for them? And we don't actually find a strong response. These birds are not actually selecting for one or the other. So why might that be? Well, there's usually only 2 tree species in this habitat, so there's really not that many to choose from. And there's a lot of studies that suggest that, in fact, they prefer to forage in pinyon, but almost all these birds nest in juniper. So they may actually be selecting for both. But what were the exceptions? Well, birds that like edges and canopy gaps, they quite like less pinyon, probably because you get a lot of little clearings when pinyons die from insects or drought. And these are birds that take advantage of those clearings. Conversely, there's 3 cavity nesting birds that really do like pinyon pine more. And again, we don't really know why that is, but it's possible that pinyons are more weakened by drought, and or woodpeckers really like to nest in them, and they have more nesting cavities for these birds. So there are selections for one or the other, but overall, the effects are pretty small, and these birds are generally seem to be happy to have a mix or one or the other, and they're not strongly associated with all pinyon or all juniper. And similarly, most of the birds are not associated with particular shrub species. So really overall, pinyon juniper birds are like, no, I don't really care what the composition of plants is. I'm happy with any kind of shrub. There are a few exceptions, but overall, in the vast majority of cases, there's not a preference for shrubs. And then we looked at canopy cover and canopy height, right? Because these are things that are really going to be affected by thinning, by die-offs. And we find very few effects at the scale that we looked at, which is within about 40 meters of our survey point. And we had a pretty high variation. We had 10 to 40% canopy cover across our sites. So intriguingly here, normally specialist birds or specialist organisms are very sensitive to disturbance and change. In Pinyon juniper, it's the opposite, right? It's these generalist forest birds that occur in a wide variety of other habitats that are associated with higher canopy cover and higher canopy heights. And in fact, the Pinyon juniper specialist birds are associated with lower canopy cover in the case of gray vireo, and lower canopy height in the case of Pinyon Jay and the scrub jay and juniper titmouse. So this is a really intriguing thing. I was talking about how variable Pinyon juniper is, and it's possible that these specialist birds are actually adapted to a habitat which is incredibly variable across their range, and that in fact protects them from some of these changes, because the amount of variability inherent in canopy cover in Pinyon juniper across the range of that habitat is greater probably than what was included in this study. So there's probably some resilience to that, to moderate thinning at the local scale at least. But obviously, if you go clear cutting things, that has been shown that you in fact lose these Pinyon juniper specialist species. So there is some limit. Is it at the landscape scale? Is it just that if you have to take out all the conifers? We don't really know yet, but there's probably some minimum amount of canopy cover, at least at the landscape scale, that they need to thrive. And yeah, as I mentioned, right, the loss of canopy cover at the landscape scale has been shown to be much more negative than at local scales for many of these species in studies. But this is just to show when we estimate the density of these birds across the range of canopy cover in our study, the model is not suggesting that there's massive thresholds, that there's, that these birds are being lost. But we're looking at a 40-meter radius scale. We're not looking at a 600-meter radius scale. So I just want to make that clear. And we thought canopy was going to be the be-all end-all. It turns out, no, it was actually the shrubs that we should have been focusing on all along. So the shrub foliage cover was actually really important for a subset of the community, which are these insectivorous gleaners. So these are birds that pick insects off of leaves and branches. And they tend to be birds that prefer deciduous vegetation overall. So that includes our vireos, blue-gray gnatcatcher, spotted towhee, and black-headed grosbeak. On the other side, we actually found that the trunk foraging bird, the white-breasted nuthatch, and two flycatchers, they do not like more shrubs. They don't like shrubs at all, in fact. And so you actually have this case where the amount of shrubs is partially determining the composition of the insectivore guild in your Pinyon juniper bird community. And why are shrubs so important? Well, for one, they're the only deciduous vegetation in most Pinyon juniper. There are exceptions. And they probably have higher densities of insects that you can feed your babies. We also know that thinning and die-offs increase the shrub cover. And so that actually is probably a mechanism by which both of those things increase the density of some species and decrease the density of others, the flycatchers, after thinning and die-off. And we know too that shrubs really don't like fire. We know that there's often an initial decline in shrubs, and then they increase, and it may be due to how people are clearing. But basically, if you are clearing and you're taking out shrubs, you're taking out a massive amount of resources that birds are using. So the shrub layer is very important for some, and either positively or negatively. And this is just to showcase, like, these increases are nonlinear, right? We're seeing massive increases. When you go from 1% shrub cover to like 50% shrub cover, you're seeing like a 200% increase in blue-gray gnatcatcher breeding density, which is very high. I mean, these are massive increases that we're seeing. So this effect is is very strong. And some of these things are clearly keying in on shrubs at the microhabitat scale. All right, this another imposing one, but I promise I'll walk you through it, and I think it makes sense when we look at it to kind of bring everything together, right? So, what are patterns of species responses? This is an ordination, a PCA, and what it is actually looking at each of these arrows represents one of our covariates, and we're actually looking at the responses to those covariates as a group. So each of the dots shows like the pattern of the bird's responses to all of these factors. And we can kind of look at the x-axis as a measure of the successional stage of our woodland. So on the left-hand side, we have early successional stage 1, stage 2, right? These have high shrubs. They have a lot of shrub cover. They have a lot of saplings because they're early successional. And on the right-hand side, we have our stage 3, late successional, conifer-dominated woodlands. And so those tend to have more snags. They tend to have more canopy cover. And they do on some level have more pinyon pine. So that's the x-axis. What is the y-axis? Well, I would argue that it's kind of a measure of vegetation complexity. In other words, how many layers of foliage do you have going from the ground to the canopy? And at the top, we have kind of a low vegetation complexity, and where we don't actually have very many layers of vegetation at all, because it's either a high canopy height and nothing can grow under it, or we have like an early successional habitat that has a lot of shrubs, but it doesn't have a lot of conifers. And at the bottom, we actually have this high vegetation complexity where these are woodlands that have a shrub layer, they have high shrubs, they have a sub-canopy, and they have a canopy. And so this is something approaching the structure you would find in a forest. So, well, for one thing, we see this kind of clustering of birds in the upper right-hand quadrant, which tends to mean that many of our birds in Pinyon-juniper, they like their densities are higher in late successional woodlands, conifer-dominated woodlands, but with a low vegetation complexity. They don't really want it to be very complex. And the exceptions to that, the birds that are found in early successional woodlands, they tend to like low vegetation complexity, like our gray vireo. And where is our friend the Pinyon Jay? The Pinyon Jay is way off by himself in a corner, and that's a really weird response. Typically, birds don't like both early successional and high vegetation complexity habitat, because that doesn't really exist in nature. And what's going on here? Well, Pinyon Jays, they use habitat in a variety of ways. They cache seeds in early successional habitat, but they also like to breed in closed canopy woodland. And so when you want both, you end up with a very weird combination of factors. But just, I also want to underline that Pinyon Jay is off by itself. It responds to habitat in a very different way from the rest of this community. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind if we're trying to use Pinyon Jay as a kind of umbrella species for Pinyon juniper conservation. It doesn't respond in the same way as the other species. Those two birds that are decreasing happen to be in this late successional high vegetation complexity quadrant that not as many birds are in. And so that's intriguing, right? We also get the bird that colonized is in this early successional low vegetation complexity quadrant. And so I think what we're seeing here is that on some level, our populations of these birds are responding to structural changes in the woodland, and that with drought, with dieback, because there's not been any clearing at some of these sites, we actually have a shift in the structure towards early successional and towards low vegetation complexity. And a lot of things benefit from that. But if you're ash-throat flycatcher or mountain chickadee, you don't. And those species populations were declining. So that's intriguing. Indirect effects of structure have effects on populations. So what does this mean again? Well, PJ birds are resilient to thinning and tree mortality at the local scale, but landscape level factors are probably way more important. We can't really evaluate in this study. There's not a strong preference for plant species composition, maybe because this habitat is so variable, and you can't specialize because it's so different in every place you encounter it. Shrubs are really important, and we do know that it changes the composition of the insectivore community as well. So shrubs are something to keep in mind in terms of management. And most species prefer simpler structure, not more complex structure. Probably one reason why we're seeing populations increasing for a lot of species because structure is being simplified due to climate change. Oh, nice. I love it when there we go. So if you're trying to kind of come away with some take-home messages about who's benefiting and who's not, well, white-breasted nuthatch and mountain chickadee are probably most vulnerable to local and landscape thinning. And mountain chickadee specifically is very vulnerable to pinyon pine loss and to loss of vegetation complexity. So that's a bird that's just not doing well. And sure enough, it's not doing well at Grand Canyon, where a lot of the pinyon pines have died back or died off. Then you get this other category of birds that are vulnerable to extreme or landscape level thinning or pinyon pine death based on what we're seeing from this site at Bandelier. But obviously we need a better understanding of what the thresholds are for canopy cover for these species and what are the scales that are biologically relevant for them. And then we have another group of birds that benefit from understory shrub cover. And these are birds that if you want to maintain, you're going to want to think about maintaining shrubs before and after clearing, or even in the absence of clearing. Last but not least, and very briefly, because I feel like I'm going over time already, I wanted to talk briefly about two future projects, which may or may not happen. There have been a few hiccups in the funding situation over the last few weeks, so we shall see. But one is an inventory of Pinyon Jay on Park Service lands, and this is across the full Colorado Plateau. So with 24 different units in collaboration with the Park Service and with the University of Delaware. So that's very exciting. And we're actually using a methodology developed by the Pinyon Jay Working Group for this, which is using 2.5 by 2.5 kilometers grid cells, which will include a mix of both in-person surveys and ARUs to better understand occupancy and whether the birds are breeding within these grid cells. And hopefully also relate, I was talking about landscape level factors. Well, hopefully we're going to relate jay occupancy to landscape level factors, including things like climate, masting, topography, and habitat amount and fragmentation. So that is hopefully going to be implemented next year, 2026. Another project that I'm really excited about is a collaboration with BLM in Utah to better understand what happens when we remove PJ, right? So conifer removal, whether it's chaining or mastication or whatever, how is that affecting PJ bird communities, especially at the landscape scale? So here we're actually looking at using ARUs, and we're really focused on effects of time since treatment, the distance to edge. In other words, are there edge effects and treatment type? Like how does this affect the Pinyon-juniper birds and then the sagebrush birds that you're creating habitat for when you remove conifers? And so we are hoping to look at both landscape effects, right, amount of edge and amount of habitat, but also local variables in explaining occupancy of birds. So a few final thoughts. I think that there's evidence from this work to suggest that indirect effects of climate on woodlands structure specifically outweigh direct effects of drought when it comes to PJ birds specifically. So there are, in fact, much of the community actually likes older growth stands, but they do benefit from the thinning and the die-off that occurs. And I think there's a lot of question marks that we still don't understand how these birds are responding at the landscape scale, whether that's habitat amount, edge effects, isolation, topography, and there's other factors, I think, including molt migration, its role, and pinyon pine masting that we just don't understand enough about how these birds are responding to those factors, even though we know that they're being affected by climate change. So I would say that there's a lot of really promising avenues for future research with Pinyon-juniper birds. And as Meredith said at the beginning, we are very interested in exploring a lot of these questions with future partners. So if you are interested in collaborations, I am also, and would love to chat with you about research on Pinyon-juniper birds. But yeah, I think I will leave you with that. Oh, I don't have a question slide, so I'll leave you with the final thoughts and any questions if we have time for that.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and go through the questions that were asked in the chat. And then if people think of questions while we're doing that, feel free to add them to the chat, or we'll see if we have time at the end for just open verbal questions. So some of these are questions, some of them are comments. Christine Johnston, sorry, pointed out that pinyon jays also occur in other vegetation types like ponderosa pine, and pinyon seeds don't necessarily comprise the majority of their diets, as the seeds are only abundant in mast years. They eat lots of other foods in non-mast years. Do you want to speak to that at all, or?
That is true, and I'm not going to question the author of the paper on Pinyon Jay habitat association. So, yeah, no, I that is very true. They don't exclusively eat pinyon pines. And in recent years have probably had to shift more towards insects. They eat insects a lot. They forage on the ground. They also will eat pines, seeds of other conifers. Up in the San Francisco peaks around Flagstaff, you'll see them feeding on limber pine seeds, for example, in some years. So they're still a corvid, they're still a generalist, but yeah, no disagreements there.
Okay. Ken Burton asked, is there any relationship between the pine nut industry and PJ birds? Are commercial pine nuts all farmed? And if so, does that create a food source for the birds?
To my knowledge, they are not farms. Someone can jump in if I'm horribly off base here, but my understanding is that much of it is collection from wild pines. So I don't actually believe that there is growth of them through like plantations or creation of habitat through growing pinyon pine.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
might
even
be
think it's
wrong.
used for limber for wood extraction either. In some cases, yes, but not on a commercial scale. I don't think.
Yeah, I may be wrong, but I think that some of the ones that you buy, pinyon pines that you buy at the grocery store, are also imported from other countries sometimes.
Okay,
Um, uh, oh, somebody just commented, pinyon isn't commercialized. Pine nuts are from Korean pine in Asia. Eric
there you
Milton,
go.
thank you. Okay, let's go to the next one. Claudia Fernari asked, so pinyon pine is expected to expand into Southern Oregon. I think this was when you were presenting some of the climate stuff.
Well, potentially. I think that's like in terms of climatic suitability, like by the end of the century, perhaps it will be more suitable. And we do think there may be northward shifts, but my understanding is that overall, based on recent papers, the pattern is not going to be shifts. It's going to be die-offs, and that the other problem with trees, unlike birds, is that the northward shifts are very, very slow. Pinyon pine takes a very long time. Like it doesn't seed as often with climate change. The conditions for young pinyon pine to establish are harder and harder with climate change. And I would think all of that is going to slow down northward movement of the tree. But there are probably more qualified botanists who could speak to that. But overall, I don't anticipate massive range shifts, rather die-offs and declines.
Great. Dave McNitt commented, would be good to look at parallels to masting in eastern hardwood forests, where acorns and other tree nuts play a major role and have been better studied.
Very true. Yeah. I mean, and even masting in other Western conifers, right? Because it isn't exclusive to pinyon pines, though. My understanding is that pinyon pines have this like level of spatial synchrony in their masting, which goes far beyond what you see in ponderosa pine, for example. Um, but yeah, I think masting overall is kind of understudied in terms of a mechanism for populations, and especially in the West.
Um, hold on one second. Oh, okay. Jason Riggio asked, could increasing Pinyon-juniper bird populations in parks but decline outside of parks point toward a negative effect of habitat management, woodland clearing, thinning, which presumably isn't happen in more strictly protected areas? Both the protected areas and non-protected areas are experiencing the same climate pressures.
Yeah, it does suggest that the causes of increases in declines, the causes of declines outside of the park are not exclusively climate related because birds are benefiting in parks. there's a lot of layers to that. Yes, it could suggest land management, but that's one cause among many. So it also oftentimes what you get in parks, so you get more of these sort of late successional old growth pinyon juniper on soils that are more mesic sometimes, like at Mesa Verde and on the South Rim. And in drier microclimates, it's possible that populations are doing different things. So that's another possibility. But I do think it's not just climate. There are other factors. If the species are declining, or climate's effects are very different across the region, based on that result, that population trends are different inside of parks and outside of parks.
There was some discussion about the reliability of breeding bird survey data. And so I don't know if you want to comment on that, or if it's just this is what we have to use
Sure.
kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's not perfect. I'm not an expert on breeding bird survey, but it's also, you're looking across a much wider variety of habitats. You're more tied to roads. There are biases compared to something that's just in one habitat in a protected area. But I still think the comparison is important, because we're actually not looking at the overall densities. We're looking at the detected change. And so however wrong both methods are, the detected change shouldn't be, whether they're off by a lot or a little, the detected change shouldn't be as dependent on that. But yeah, I mean, no, I guess I have nothing else to say about BBS.
Okay. And Imram commented about, or questioned, the effect of increasing green urban spaces on the population, maybe of pinyon juniper birds, because a new trend is birds moving towards urban spaces for more availability of food. So I don't know.
Yeah, I do believe that is a trend, and that some of these birds take advantage of water habitats. But these are birds that are typically like, if you have a gray vireo in your backyard, I'd say it's a good day. Like that is a factor, but so much of the habitat of these species occurs in wildlands and far from high density human inhabited areas that I don't know that it's a major factor in their population trends in the near future, at least.
It looks like I've gone through all the questions that I found in the chat. So if anybody has something they just want to unmute and ask, we can go ahead and give you a second to think about that. I think maybe we're good. And if you're interested, if you think of something later on, Harry's email is on our website, so you can always reach out and ask. I'd like to say thanks to Harry for putting together this presentation, and thanks to all of you for joining us.